When Martin Luther King wrote about whatever affects one directly, he was referring, of course, to racial injustice. But one purpose of the essay itself is to affect the reader. All essays attempt to explain or persuade. Sometimes the persuasion is strong and forceful, like Thomas Paine's message to the colonist. But it can be subtle, and not all essays tackle grand topics. Many essays are written about the simplicities of life. But in all cases, the author wants the reader to understand or even adopt his or her viewpoint. Essays can be grouped by their purpose. Personal essays concentrate on the writer's thoughts and experiences to entertain the reader. Expository essays explain a subject in an effort to inform the reader, and argumentative essays try to win the reader over to the writer's position. An essay can include all three purposes, even though one usually dominates. Willie Morris wrote an essay called A Love That Transcends Sadness, and it's a quiet lyrical piece that is personal, expository, and even gently persuasive. Even as we get swept up in the words, the point of the essay is clear. Morris believes that cemeteries represent not death, but tranquility through memories.
Not too long ago, in a small southern town where I live, I was invited by friends to go with them and their children to the cemetery to help choose their burial plot. My friends are in the hardiest prime of life and do not anticipate departing the Lord's earth immediately, and hence, far from being funereal, our search had an adventurous mood to it, like picking out a Christmas tree. It was that hour before twilight, and the marvelous old graveyard with its cedars and magnolias and flowering glades sang with the Mississippi springtime. The honeysuckled air was an affirmation of the tugs and tremors of living. My companions had spent all their lives in the town, and the names on even the oldest stones were as familiar to them as the people they saw every day. Location, the man of the family said, laughing. As the real estate magnates say, we want location. Their humor coincided with mine, for I am no stranger to graveyards. With rare exceptions, ever since my childhood, they have suffused me not with foreboding, but with a sense of belonging, and as I grow older, with a curious, ineffable tenderness. My dog, Pete, and I go out into the cemeteries not only to escape the telephone and those living beings who place more demands on us than the dead ever would, but to feel a continuity with the flow of the generations. Living, William Faulkner wrote, is a process of getting ready to be dead for a long time. I have never been lonely in a cemetery. They are perfect places to observe the slow changing of the seasons and to absorb human history. The tragedies and anguishes, the violences and treacheries, and always the guilts and sorrows of vanished people. In a preternatural quiet, one can almost hear the palpable long-ago voices.
Willie Morris's essay may appear at first to be random associations, but like all strong essays, it is really a tightly written, cohesive piece. Greg Olmer of the University of Florida explains how Morris has created a structured, effective piece of prose.
What we maybe overlook is the extraordinary way in which this is organized, so that all along the way we know exactly what he's talking about. The brilliance of the piece is the extent to which it's intelligible from the very beginning. He orients the reader, saying exactly what he's going to do by setting up a little scene, which very naturally just tells an anecdote, but this serves the function of orientation. And then he begins to elaborate on that. So the structure is really very, very tight. We know why he's elaborating on it. We know why he's talking about all of those graveyards now.
I like especially the small-town cemeteries of America, where the children come for picnics and games, as we did when I was growing up. Wandering among the stones on our own, with no adults about, to regard the mystery and inevitability of death on its terms and ours. I remember we would watch the funeral from afar in a hushed awe, and I believe that was when I became obsessed, not with death itself, but with the singular community of death and life together. And life's secrets, life's fears, life's surprises. But it is the graveyards of Mississippi which are the most moving for me, having to do, I believe, with my belonging here. They spring from the earth itself and beckon me time and again. The crumbling stones of my people evoke in me the terrible enigmas of living. In a small Civil War cemetery which I came across recently, the markers stretching away in a misty haze, it occurred to me that most of these boys had never even had a girlfriend. I have found a remote graveyard in the hills with photographs on many of the stones, some nearly 100 years old. The women in bonnets and Sunday dresses, the men in overalls, the short and simple annals of the poor. I am drawn here to the tiny grave of a little girl. Her name was Fairy Jumper, and she lived from April 8, 1914 to January 16, 1919. There is a miniature lamb at the top of the stone, and the words, "A fairer bud of promise never bloomed." There are no other jumpers around her, and there she is, my fairy, in a far corner of that country burial ground. So forlorn and alone that it is difficult to bear.
By lyrically describing all the cemeteries he has visited, Morris is gently trying to persuade the reader to adopt his viewpoint. But does the persuasion work? As with all essays, it depends on the reader.
One of the major ways of persuading is simply what's called ethos, the character of the essayist. And so we have this idea of Willie's character as a very likable person. We learn about him, we see that he, whether we knew anything about him before or not.
But William Vesterman of Rutgers University has a much different opinion of the essay.
But he seems to be trying to persuade me to look at death in a calmer and wiser and more humorous way than I presumably have already, and that he has already achieved that view, and I don't like it. He makes death into a matter of the picturesque, whether of sentiment on tombstones or nice little settings in rural towns, and that's not what death means to me. It's a great horror, and I am not pacified in my horror or made more bravely to face it by having him go around Oxford and look at tombstones.
Although the effects of a personal essay may be different for several readers, the writer's viewpoint should be easily interpreted.
That's what it's meant to do. Say, here's the kind of person I am, here's the way my mind works, this is the way I get from subject to subject when I'm reflecting to myself.
Sitting there now in the dappled sunshine, a middle-aged man and his middle-aged dog, gazing across at the untenanted terrain awaiting its dead, I thought of how each generation lives with its own exclusive solicitudes. The passions, the defeats, the victories, the sacrifices, the names and dates and the faces belong to each generation in its own passing. For much of everything except the most unforgettable is soon forgotten. And yet, though much is taken, much abides. I thought then of human beings on this cinder of a planet out at the edge of the universe, not knowing where we came from, why we are here, or where we might go after death. And yet, we still laugh and cry and feel and love. All that we can know about those we have loved and lost, Thornton Wilder wrote, is that they would wish us to remember them with a more intensified realization of their reality. What is essential does not die, but clarifies. The highest tribute to the dead is not grief, but gratitude.